It's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the most responsive to change. My first real exposure to changes in soil and water came in Peace Corps in Mauritania, Northwest Africa. In the Sahel region of Africa, your rain comes in a 2-week period and floods out thousands of acres. These farmers have been farming in the same way for thousands of years, putting it in by hand and taking it out by hand, in tune with nature. After farming for thousands of years, in the mid-80s this system seemed to come to a stop with 3 years of no rain. It wasn't till later, when the science of climate change had started to develop, that this catastrophe was better understood. Adding conservation practices to their cropping system seemed to be a good solution to some of the problems that they were going to be faced with. This was my first exposure to the effect that climate change can have in a global situation. My second experience in managing soil and water resources in a cropping system came at the Sangamon County Soil and Water District, where I started as a soil and water engineering technician, then a resource conservationist, and finally a BMP research technician. In the early 1990s, this best management practice research project was the first of its kind to monitor on a watershed scale on the losses of nutrients and chemicals flowing from the fields. At the time, filter strips was one of our key conservation practices, but much of Mother Nature showed us that more conservation practices needed to be developed if we were going to slow down the loss of nutrients and chemicals. This was the second time that I walked away from a job not having clear answers how to protect our soil and water from weather extremes in our current cropping system. Perhaps a better understanding of the whole farming system is needed. My third job experience came with my self-employed Mud Prairie Ecosystem Restoration Company, where I restored prairies and savannas to their healthy, natural habitat. After a foundation of grasses are established and augmented by a large number of flowering forbs, the maintenance to the whole system begins. Invasive species are removed and maintenance is put in place that will benefit the whole system. This type of management is rotated around the system to make it beneficial to the largest variety of species development. Though the health of the system seems to be slow in the beginning, many things start to appear that are benefits to the whole system. Balance in its diversity seems to be key to the health of any ecosystem. At Illinois Stewardship Alliance, I've been working on conservation practices that improve soil health and water quality to make a more sustainable food system. In providing a platform for our more experienced farmers and educators to talk to their fellow farmers about their management skills and understanding in their adoption of a more diversified cropping system, will we better protect our local food production resources. The first step in this process is to find these early adopters that are passionate about their conservation practices. Another effective tool is to conduct a survey to evaluate if farmers feel the need to improve soil health and water quality and what those practices might be. Another great tool is a local core working group of area farmers, ag service providers, and community leaders that can give ownership to the project and give it local driven success. These core working groups are key in finding advanced farmers as well as bringing on partners to help get the funding to augment these new conservation practices that will be needed to improve the soil health and water quality in each local community. Hosting these advanced nutrient managers, no-tillers, and cover crop users in the local settings of each town in field days and workshops is the best first step. Bringing together these beginning and advanced conservation cropping systems farmers in regional settings helps to develop a culture of farmers that are focused on improving the sustainability of our food production system statewide. Developing video material that addresses the management of conservation practices that address soil health and water quality is another tool to reach farmers that would prefer not to leave the farm and have internet. It takes the partnership and collaboration of a lot of different organizations to do research, develop educational as well as financial support to improve the sustainability of our food production system, ecological as well as economical. Citizens in both the rural and urban communities need to voice their concern that program funding from our legislators in both federal and state need to stay in place. Cuts to our conservation program are a constant threat. Why is this so important? Franklin Delano Roosevelt said it best: "A nation that destroys its soil destroys itself." We need to stay vigilant in monitoring the effects of our current farming systems. We know that increasing organic matter has a positive influence on soil aggregation and aggregate stability, which decreases soil loss. We also know that tillage can decrease organic matter. We need to stop mining organic matter and start adding it back. One of the keys is to keep more plant residue on the surface of the soil, feeding the soil for 12 months of the year. Not only how much we grow, but what we grow also has an effect on organic matter. Nitrogen-fixing plants like legumes also help. Organic matter affects the whole process. Even with phosphorus, when you add organic matter, you're increasing the availability, the form, and how much you can use. Another one of the key impacts on the reduction in organic matter is the amount of water that can be stored in the soil. We're seeing more water run off of the soil as opposed to running into the soil and being held. With the escaping carbon and nitrogen entering into the atmosphere, this is only compounding the situation, adding to the amount of erosion and flooding. How am I monitoring my cropping system and responding to the needs for change on my farm? It all ties to the management of the organic matter and the soil health and the monitoring of my water quality. One of my first adaptation of change came during my soil and water days with filter strips and no-till. To improve the efficiency in my nutrient management, I adopted a rotation of corn, soybean, and extended wheat into the rotation and added manure injected into the stubbled wheat ground. In extreme weather events, no-till, filter strips, and adding wheat still wasn't enough to slow the nutrient loss. More protection is needed. Keeping the soil covered during the months it's normally exposed in the winter and after wheat is the next logical step. Designing a cover crop system that meets my goals in my cropping system is the first step. Raising artisan grains for local bakeries or breweries can help local communities as well as help the economics of my crop rotation by adding diversity that builds soil health. Harvesting artisan small grains in July gives you the ability to raise more organic matter to feed organisms and to safely store nutrients for further crops. Deep-rooted cover crops during the winter is doing your biological tillage for you. Planting your beans into cereal while it's still green is truly continuous living cover with the benefit of weed suppression. Think of feeding yourself like feeding the soil, and green things are healthier for you. In marginal lands or critical drainage patterns, perennial cropping systems would be a permanent protection solution. This type of perennial cropping system can be ecologically beneficial as well as a cropping system that is economical as well. An evolution in plant breeding has also developed a cross between wheat and intermittent wheatgrass to give us our first perennial wheat crop. The reason perennial crops like Kernza are so important is their large root systems. This adds a much greater ability to trap carbon and nutrients in water, which leads to improved drought and flood tolerance. These also add greater biomass, better soil structure, and a safer carbon sequestration. It's easy to see why crops like Kernza will be so important in the future. Kernza can be used as an economically viable buffer strip because it can also be used as a food source. Or you can feed it after you've harvested it, grows back, and you can use it as feed. So, on this farm, in monitoring soil health and water quality, comparing to prairie versus cropland, the prairie is definitely a dynamic ecosystem, but as you add benefits to the croplands, I'm seeing increases in organic matter and infiltration. What you're seeing here is a test of 3 similar cubes that were pulled out of the soil. The one on the left was a prairie cube, the one in the middle was conservation tillage, and the one on the right shows no-till and cover crops after 3 months of exposure to the weather. Having similar watershed sizes for the 2 ponds, seeing success is easy. In a 2 flood event, 3 inches one day, and then 3 days later 4 more inches, the cropland pond raised 3 feet after the event and went out the emergency spillway, where the prairie pond only raised a half a foot. Both were fairly clear. The prairie pond was definitely clearer, but you see the advantages of soil health in prairie, but know that there is less runoff with soil erosion in the cropland due to the cover crops. Having the continuous living cover has definitely helped in tying up the nutrients from entering into the pond. Still not quite to the prairie, but close. The benefit to the prairie are those perennial massive species sponges, and I think as my perennial crops in Kernza and the woody perennial cropping system develop, it will be more and more like the prairie. In natural ecosystems, different plants target different nutrients during different seasons and even different weather extremes. This plant diversity influences the stability of the soil. Adding larger cover crop mixes will help with that diversity and stability in soil health in cropland. In this farm, using incentives from the different NRCS and FSA programs has been key in establishing a wide diversity of conservation practices in this conservation cropping system. There is a multitude of benefits in field borders and prairie strips. In riparian buffers, they're building soil and capturing nutrients. In windbreaks, they're slowing soil and capturing nutrients. And alley cropping adds diversity to the system in a perennial cropping system. The importance of invasive species in timber also affects nutrients. Wetland restoration and protection is key in holding nutrients, and cropland restoration is key in completing the system. Till the soil little as possible, grow as many different species of plants, keep 12 months of continuous living cover, and leave the residue in place. Who benefits from a more nature-based cropping system? Habitats are protecting, balance is maintained, the whole world benefits. This has been the Farm Steward Podcast series production.